And let's stick with the Trump announcement of tariffs. We are now about just over an hour and a half away from the White House announcement. Let's bring in Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective, Dr. Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you, Dr. Pheko. Good to have you on The Full View here on SABC News. How sound is Donald Trump's economic and trade policy at this stage?
Yeah, so basically he is trying to build an artillery of measures in order to do a couple of things. He wants to build jobs, build up the job market in the United States. He wants to reduce the cost of consumers and the cost of consumption for consumers in the U.S. And this includes, of course, by putting up tariffs at a huge amount at 20%, a potential blanket 20%. And the third thing that he wants to do is that over the next 10 years, he wants to ensure that prices in general in the U.S. economy go down and that the economy expands at quite a rapid level. But there's a whole bunch of intuitiveness that takes place there. The one is that, of course, what happens is that if you pass on the cost of production and the cost through tariffs to other countries, this builds up the price, this boosts up the price for domestic consumers. The second thing is that, of course, there's no such a thing as an American job per se. Many of the cost of the components that are being placed tariffs on at the moment from China, from Japan, from South Korea, and different countries, the cost of those components are exactly what is going to boost up the cost of these goods. And of course, the final part is that the assembly of many of these goods also takes place offshore. So this idea that by doing this, that President Trump is going to somehow rehabilitate or resuscitate so-called American jobs is a fallacy. So I would say not so sound at all.
And just on that then, where would it leave the global economy and trade if some of these other regions of the world impose tit-for-tat tariff increases of their own against American goods and products?
Yeah, so I mean, we've already seen that countries like China, like Vietnam, like Mexico and the European Union and different countries within the European Union have threatened. I think Germany so far has been very explicit in their wish in their great resolve and in their illustration that they too can play quite bully and can play quite big at the moment. And I think what this does is that it also means that we're going to have much greater instability between and within nations in the context of trade and in goods and services. It also means, of course, that we're going to have to potentially see the WTO taking on a much more robust role that it hasn't played for about 10 or 15 years, actually. So there's a dispute mechanism there that is supposed to resolve trade conflicts, and that's exactly supposed to ensure that trade flows smoothly and that members' rights under the WTO trade agreement are upheld. We are aware that the United States has for many years basically circumvented the World Trade Organization. There's also fair to say that the negotiations and commitments that take place within the WTO context around trade tariff reductions and commitments during different trade rounds, specifically the Uruguay round, and which led to an increased market security, especially for traders and for investors. So what Mr. Trump is doing is really circumventing the WTO and rendering it not so much useless, but certainly rendering it as a defunct formation and engaging in bilateral and multilateral agreements, and in this case unilateralism, which is completely against the ethos of world trade protocols and international trade protocols, as problematic as those already are, as highly hinged towards global North European, US, Canadian interests as they are. They certainly at least are some kind of an anchor. What Mr. Trump is doing, of course, is behaving completely unilaterally and against the spirit of the ethos of any kind of internationalism and international trade, in the sense that it has come to be understood over the past 30 years.
In that context, then, what does a country like South Africa do to protect itself when you consider that you've got a Donald Trump who doesn't much care for world bodies that are meant to negotiate issues around trade? We know he's not even a fan, for example, of the broader United Nations system. That's a separate issue. But in terms of trade, he also has made it clear that even countries like South Africa that are part of deals that allow for a tariff-free business, i.e. AGOA, he's not going to touch them in terms of the imposition of tariffs on other goods.
So AGOA, of course, is not actually a bilateral agreement. And I think this is one of the things where this is our point of departure within our own understanding of how bilateral and trade agreements work, should be sharpened at a time such as this. AGOA is a U.S. project. It is primarily interested in expanding the United States footprint. And I certainly think that as South Africa, we have not gained much from AGOA. So some of the countries around us, Lesotho, Eswatini, and others have certainly gained far more because of their status as least developed countries in inverted commas. But we as South Africa gain very little from AGOA. It's more of a diplomatic arrangement. I think the other thing as well is that when we think around the ways in which then we can begin to resist, we too have our own ability and a capacity to begin to put in place tariffs and tariff bindings. And tariff bindings are really just these instruments where we can agree to bind tariff rates and agree on maximum tariff levels, and we can charge on imports from other WTO members, including the United States. And these duties then become a commitment or a promise that's made to different trading partners. But in the case of South Africa, we are well within our remit, even within those kind of international agreements, to state on what basis we would like to export our steel, export our coal, export our iron, bearing in mind that we are responsible for 25%, almost a quarter, of all U.S. imports of steel and of iron. We are actually holding cards, and I think it would, we need to behave this way. And as somebody said earlier on, AGOA is not a one-way economic relationship. It is actually supposed to be a manual for ensuring predictability for the U.S. market. We have every right within that framework and within that remit to think about whether or not this AGOA agreement is working for us, and whether or not we can reframe some of the agreements that we have with the United States, whether we use the WTO as a form of as a recess as well as a recourse, or whether or not we're able to then begin to think about our own taxes and bindings on U.S. products. We also have the levity to be able to think about, and I use this term very cautiously, but certainly to retaliate, some kind of retaliation to say, if you're not going to take our coal or take our steel at this particular, at the rates and at the prices that we have set, and without these very onerous tariff bindings, which make our exports incredibly expensive for us and reduce our profit margins, we too can perhaps think about the sorts of products that the product lines that we receive from the US, and where we might also want to impose something quite similar. We are not powerless in this.
Thank you very much for speaking to us, Dr. Lebohang Pheko, Senior Research Fellow at Trade Collective.